But I don't think that sunstroke or an unexpected rush of blood to the head could explain or excuse comments that are dominating the news agenda today. Is it worth beginning with some observations that are largely true? Okay. BBC dropped an enormous clanger at the weekend. It is an epic editorial failure, almost so inevitable that you could have seen it coming from space. It strikes me that to decide not to broadcast Kneecap for reasons I probably don't need to explain, and to broadcast instead their sort of effective support act when a cursory glance at their Instagram account would reveal that they were perhaps, I would say, at least as likely to say or do something inflammatory and possibly criminal, means that somebody should have been watching that in the way that Keith listens to this programme. Regular listeners may need an explainer here. So Keith listens to this programme, or at least he's supposed to, with his finger hovering like Billy the Kid's trigger finger over what we call the dump button. And that is not so much in case I say something out of order, although, but in case you do. And if you were to say something out of order, he hits the dump button, we lose a few seconds, go back a few seconds on the programme, and hopefully we avoid either causing enormous offence or committing an act of potential criminality, most obviously in the realms of sort of defamation, contempt of court, and libel. So somebody should have been hovering over that button, like Keith hovers over the dump button. I appreciate that's a fairly unfortunate juxtaposition of mental imagery and language, but that is what it's called. And he hovers over it like a hawk for 3 hours every day, barely takes time off to have a banana or a cup of tea or check his socials or all of the things that you might expect he'd be doing of a morning, instead of hovering. So there is the first truth. The BBC have dropped an enormous clanger, and as is the way of such things, I predict that deputy heads will roll. It's the period of time as well, you know, excusable. The first one that slips through or the second one that slips through, but to have it still up and to have it still broadcastable or watchable is inexcusable. That's an epic professional failure into which people will read whatever they want, but all you can say with certainty is that somebody in that chain of command, possibly somebodies plural, dropped an enormous clanger. The second thing you can say, I would argue, and may have to this morning with absolute certainty, is that the character who called for death to the IDF is, and you remember that the language I can use on this programme is policed by Ofcom, is a pillock of the very, very first order. And bear with me on this, because he may hold opinions that you are sympathetic to, but you can't call for the death of anybody from the stage of a public event, anybody being the operative point. There might be some wiggle room. Calling for the death of soldiers, you might think, is preferable to calling for the death of everybody from a certain ethnicity or religion or football team. And of course, I'd respond by pointing out that the IDF is made up of conscripts, largely. They have no choice, really, about being there, short of being imprisoned for objection, but they are also human beings, and calling for the death of soldiers who are but quite possibly following orders that you find repugnant is a stupid and dangerous thing to do. If I veer briefly into the realm of opinion rather than listing truths, then they set back the cause in many ways, in appalling ways, because the kind of people who would have described everybody on a Palestinian protest march as supporting terrorism are rubbing their hands with glee at this kind of thing. This is where we move into the realms of being able to hold two opinions in your head at the same time. So hideous humans, whose death I would never ever call for, either publicly or privately. Hideous humans who've tried from the very start to conflate support for the civilians in Gaza, support for the Palestinian people, are rubbing their hands with glee today at the prospect of some. It doesn't matter that you've never heard of him before, but they're rubbing their hands with glee today at the fact that one of their enemies has engaged in precisely the same conflation. So you can disapprove on an enormous scale of what the IDF is doing. And this morning, as you are almost certainly not aware, Israel has ordered evacuations in northern Gaza. So people who have already been shifted from pillar to post countless times have been shifted once again from the latest pillar to the latest post. We think that 23 people were killed on Sunday alone. So you could probably put the number of people killed since Bob Vylan undertook their set at Glastonbury in, I'd say, close to triple figures. 85 is the number that I've been able to conjure up or calculate. So ask yourself this, which is the direction in which we're moving. How do we end up talking more about one thing than the other? And I'm guilty of that as well, which is part of the reason why I'm so keen to ask the question. Other things that I think are, some things that are true. Many expert observers consider Israel's actions to have crossed the threshold for genocide. It is almost impossible to argue that they haven't committed war crimes. And there is no definition of ethnic cleansing, for example, that doesn't fit precisely the policies they have pursued in Gaza. The occupations in the West Bank are and remain completely illegal. The violence visited upon people who are living or trying to live peaceful lives on their land by illegal settlers is hideous and, incessant and egregious and all of those things. What else can we put on the list of things that's true? I don't know if you're aware of this. The BBC defended a comedian's comments about Jeremy Corbyn a few years ago after he said, or effectively said, that if you were to drop a bomb on Glastonbury, you'd be able to get him, because he was there at the time, and all of his fans as well. This is a comedian called Finn Taylor, who compared the former Labour leader to Bob Dylan and said, I only hate him so much because of his fans. People think that Bob Dylan's the greatest musician that ever lived, and you listen to some of it and it's awful, but then people are so dogmatic and say he's the greatest musician. People who like Corbyn, it's 200,000 people in the Labour Party that are fanatics, so all you've got to do next year is bomb Glastonbury. Hopefully Dylan's headlining, two birds, one stone. So in much the same way that when Joe Brand joked about battery acid and milkshakes, nobody took her seriously, nobody took him seriously. And unless there is a large crowd of people on the streets of Somerset who are currently toe-to-toe with members of the Israeli Defence Force, then some ludicrous parallels that I've seen this morning with the case of Lucy Connolly, who of course called for a pogrom against refugees and asylum seekers in state-funded accommodation, are among the stupidest things I've seen in public discourse. And I wouldn't even give them the time of day if they hadn't appeared on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, my late father's old newspaper. So if there is a rampaging mob of people poised to murder human beings and you offer them encouragement and support, your action is on a different planet entirely from somebody inciting violence against people on the other side of the world whom your audience is never likely to encounter or meet. I can't believe I need to explain that. I'm not even sure that I do, because anybody who doesn't understand is probably lying or pretending, but I'm happy to get that out there as well. So all of those things are true. Bob Vylan's comments on the stage were all of the things that his critics have described them. It was appalling hate speech. It was obnoxious and insightful. It was arguably anti-Semitic, because there won't be many non-Jews in the Israeli Defence Force, but there will be some. And of course, the distinction, the hair that you might want to split between calling for death to all Muslims or death to all Jews and death to members of an army, death to actual combatants, is, for me, probably pertinent, but not particularly. So why? Why are we like the way we are? Why are we like this? Humans. All of us. Let me read you this from David. Please, can you talk about what is happening in Gaza? What I heard over the weekend was horrific. Starving children, innocent Palestinians being used for target practice and being shot at while they queue for food. Aid stations being set up in places that are deliberately designed to be hard to get to. This is what David believes he has seen. Designed to draw out and displace the Palestinians even more. It's appalling. It needs to be stopped. There are also reports that some soldiers are receiving orders to kill. It's not being spoken about enough. The BBC has recently refused to air a documentary that addresses some of these issues. Fortunately, Channel 4 will be showing it, so I will watch it there. And I do. I think probably more than anywhere else except Channel 4. We talk about the plight of the Palestinian people in Gaza on this programme repeatedly and regularly. We can't do it every day. And we have already done it today. The idea of conducting a conversation about what happened in Glastonbury this weekend without talking about Gaza would be a bit like trying to have a conversation about cake without talking about flour or eggs or butter or icing. But it doesn't defend, excuse, and possibly even explain the actions of this character you had never, ever heard of before. I'd have a quick look at some of the people who are having a swing. I wonder if you can predict what position they'll be coming from. So you can't ever insult the IDF because they're all Jewish. Nice get out of jail free card, give your head a wobble, mate. No, of course you can insult their actions. You can critique their actions, mate. But you can't call for them all to be killed. And if you listen to the words that I actually said, some people will seek to describe and define it as an anti-Semitic action. I am not actually one of them, which is why I'm talking about why the enemies of the Palestinian people will be rubbing their hands with glee today. And you're proving my point for me, mate. Perhaps your head is the one most in need of a wobble, because this gives enormous succour and ammunition to the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Suella Bravermans of this world, who are desperate to claim that everybody who wants innocent Palestinians to stop being killed is somehow supportive of Hamas or possessed of murderous bloodlust towards all Israelis, or on this occasion, just the soldiers. Didn't stop the Daily Mail, and this is a very pertinent point. It didn't stop the Daily Mail from describing it as a death to Israelis chants, whereas whether you consider it to be hair-splitting or not, it was death to Israeli soldiers that this, and I'll use the word once more, this pillock was calling for. 10:16 is the time. So why do we find it so much easier to talk about this than we do to talk about what's actually happening in Gaza? And to make it easier for you this morning, I'm going to include myself in that category. I sometimes at the weekend hear a story, stumble across a story, get hit over the head with a story and think, well, that's my 10 o'clock on Monday taken care of. And it's not. I mean, it's very much a first world problem, but, you know, the thought of turning up for work and not being able to find anything that we might find engaging together is, well, it focuses the mind somewhat, shall we say. So it's nice, for want of a better word, to encounter over the course of the weekend or the afternoon and evening on a weekday something that I think will lend itself to our time together the following morning. And there is a little bit of that. You go and I think to yourself, oh, that's interesting. I better start marshalling my thoughts on this one because we will probably be talking about it tomorrow, which doesn't hold true for the latest killings in Gaza. That is a much harder mountain to climb. You have to work for. I'm not asking for sympathy, God forbid, but it is not least because of the kind of messages that I feel I have a duty to look at least, rather than ignore. But the difficulty of having a nuanced, informed conversation when you've got people on one side claiming that you're a tool for the Israeli regime and under the others claiming that you're one of the biggest anti-Semites in history is I think there'd be something wrong with you if that washed off your back. Even if it's all Horlicks, there'd be something wrong with you if it washed off your back completely. So why do we find it so much easier to talk about an idiot at Glastonbury saying something stupid than we do about what is happening in Gaza? 0345 6060 973. Why? What is it? And I'm looking for psychology. I'm looking for personal as well as political observations. I am guilty. I can't sit here and say, why have they put this on the front page when they haven't put the latest deaths in aid queues? Because I know why they haven't. I know in my bones why they haven't. It's the same reason why my ears prick up when I see a story like this Bob Vylan story in a way that they don't when I hear another tale, when I see another statistic about innocent people in Palestine being murdered. So I'm happy to keep explaining why this character has done immeasurable harm to the cause of pro-Palestinian people in this country. But what I want you to tell me is why you think we find it so much easier, so much more inviting, so much more pleasant somehow to get stuck into this story of outrageous comments and carefully cultivated outrage in response than we do about the reality of what is, by most or by many accounts now, probably a genocide and certainly a series of war crimes. Why? How can people profess to be more offended by an idiot rapper shouting bilge from the stage in Somerset than they are by the continuing carnage in Gaza? It's extraordinary when you stop to think about it, right? But I'm guilty as well. I think that the situation in Gaza is 17 million times worse than anything that happened at Glastonbury over the weekend. But as a radio phone-in host, I'm probably at the apex of the process that I'm seeking to analyse today. Why do we find it so much easier to do this than we do to do that?